Now we're going to disassemble the front pump and intermediate clutch piston assembly. If you recall, this is what first came out of the main body of the transmission. Looking at the business side of it, notice we have 5 bolts that hold our spring retainer for our clutch piston. These same 5 bolts also hold the front pump halves together. Also on the front pump, we have a series of sealing rings. These all have to be removed and replaced. On this particular setup, this first sealing ring is a one-piece Teflon ring. To remove this seal, we use a small seal pick to get underneath the seal and stretch it slightly outward and lift it back up over the shaft and roll it back. Underneath this seal was a tension spring, which we removed by getting up under the end gap and working around and pulling it off much like a piston ring. Next, we have interlocking gapless rings. To remove them, you push from the opposite side of the gap, and then you push down from one side next to the gap, and they'll spring apart. Gently expand them with your fingers at the gap, just large enough to lift off of the shaft. Once all the seals have been removed, the needle thrust bearing can be removed. This should be checked as all other thrust bearings for smoothness of operation. Underneath this bearing, on some applications you'll find a shim. This is later used for setting end play of the transmission. Now, we need to undo our 5 bolts, working them evenly, one bolt to the next, a little at a time, to properly release tension of our spring plate without warping it. Before all the bolts have been removed, take note that you're getting a separation between the 2 pump halves. You're going to want to put your hand underneath and support the front half of the pump so that it doesn't fall. Now finish removing your 5 retaining bolts. And let the front half of the pump down gently. Now we can remove our spring cover, our clutch springs, our clutch piston, and our pump cover. Inside the front cover of our pump, we'll have our actual high pressure oil pump. This also must be inspected for condition and wear. Before removing the pump gears, take a close look at them. They should be marked. This internal gear has a mark on this flange, and the outer gear has a mark on this tooth. This signifies that both of these faces should be toward the inside of the pump and not toward the outside of the pump. It's very important that these gears go back in the same relationship to the pump. To remove them, just lift them up and out. The gears should be inspected for wear, galling, pitting, anything that deviates from being a smooth, clean finish. Also, the internal faces of the pump should be checked for the same conditions. Also, The back side of the pump should be inspected in these areas for wear, where the pump gears also contact. On further inspection of our front pump, we came to find that the pump bushing was damaged. If we take a close look at the pump bushing, we'll notice that we're getting fragmentation of the bushing in this area, and where the bushing ends come together, we'll see that the babbitt is actually peeling off of the backing. This bushing must be replaced. Let's take a look at a new bushing before assembly, and we'll see the difference. You notice the new bushing has a continuous smooth surface, and in the parting line where the bushing is dog-legged together, we'll notice that the babbitt is intact. This is what the bushing should have looked like if we were to leave it in the pump. To change the bushing, you must use the bushing driver. The bushing is too thin and too narrow to be able to use a punch successfully without damaging it. A suitable bushing driver can be made, as we did here, very cheaply by using a pipe coupling and a piece of pipe that we turn down very slightly so that we have a little bit of clearance, a slightly loose fit to the new bushing. If we don't have enough clearance, as a bushing is installed in the housing, it contracts and will tighten around the bushing driver. With a bushing driver that's longer than the bushing is wide, we can remove the old bushing and install the new one in one-step operation. We simply put our new bushing on the driver, slide the recess of it into the original bushing. We need to put a bridge across the top because we have an open center on this driver. The new bushing should displace the old bushing and install itself in the pump cover. Because there's a lip on our driver that is bigger than the diameter of the hole the bushing goes in, it'll stop at the proper depth. Our new bushing is squarely installed in the bore, and our old bushing has been removed. Now it's time to assemble the front pump, intermediate first and second clutch piston assembly. Before me are all the parts, components of the front pump and intermediate piston assembly. Before we assemble it, we want to install our new converter seal, because it's very easy this time because we don't have the converter shaft sticking up through the front pump. To install it, we merely need to locate the seal in its proper location, put a thick piece of steel, or as we're using, a piece of hardwood across it, take your hammer and drive it down until it's seated in the housing. Also, we want to put a little bit of transmission lube on the lip seal so it's not dry during initial startup. We like to use transmission lube specifically in these transmissions because it is designed to melt very quickly and blend in with the automatic transmission fluid. Okay. That completes installation of the torque converter seal in the front pump. Also, we want to put a little bit of this assembly lube on the pump bushing so it also is not dry during final assembly and initial startup. To assist us in assembly of the front pump, we're going to use this large coffee can. Any similar device will do. And we're going to take the front section of the pump housing and lay it over the can. We're going to use this because later we need to put the rear section of our pump assembly in, and this shaft is going to extend down and through. By using the can or a similar supporting device, it makes it a lot easier to work on. First, what we have to do is put our pump gears back in, and before we put them in, we want to go cover them in transmission fluid. And once again, we have to put them in the same way they came out, meaning that we have the mark on our gear facing up, which this mark was facing up when we disassembled our pump, and the smaller gear should have these lugs facing toward the back of the transmission, and you can see the difference in depth from the front. We soak it in transmission fluid and install it in place. Check for smooth operation and lightly rub some fluid over the top. Next, we need to put our new seals on our intermediate clutch piston. As we've done before, we need just to pull the seal out, remove it, pull the inner seal toward the center, and lift it out. We also need to match up the new parts to the old ones, and as we always do, all these seals get soaked in transmission fluid before assembly. The seals have to go back in the same direction the old ones came out, with the lip facing in the direction of oil travel. Most of these seals can only go on but one way, because there's a recess lip on one side of the seal land for the sealing lip to fall into. Next, we're going to lay the rear half on top of the front half. Take a little transmission fluid and just wet the area that these piston seals come in contact with, and install our piston. By holding light pressure down the piston and using the little helper tool on the lip, you get the lip started on the inside and outside seal, and the piston will push down into place. Now we have to install all of our springs. We also have to make sure that we have the two pump sections lined up to the bolt pattern for our retaining bolts. Once we've established that, we need to line up our spring retainer to the same bolt pattern. And it's always wise to wet our bolts with transmission fluid so that they don't go in dry. We just need to start all 5 bolts. There's 2 ways to align the pump housing halves. One way, we can mimic a professional tool, which is an adjustable band that goes around the pump housing, or as we've done, we used a large and a small hose clamp together, or any arrangements of hose clamps that will encircle the entire pump housing. Installing it this way and tightening it up will align both halves satisfactorily. We want to make sure that the clamps are centered on the width of the pump housing halves, so that we have an evenly located band all the way around. Now we just need to snug the clamp, and we can go back and tighten our 5 bolts. At that point, the main part of the pump assembly will be together, and all we have left to do is install our sealing rings and thrust washer. Another way you can align the pump housing, if you don't have clamps available, but you happen to have some old 11/32 diameter stem valves, will be to install the valves, as many as possible, through the pump body to case attaching bolt holes. The more valves you can install through these holes, the more accurate the halves will be aligned. This is an old standby that has never let us down. With all these valves in place, we can now tighten our 5 attaching bolts, and the pump housing will also be aligned properly for final assembly. After the bolts are fully torqued, all we have left to do is replace our thrust washer and shim and our sealing rings. Before installing the shim, we should put a light coat of grease on it to hold it in place. Take our thrust bearing, dip it in oil so that the needle bearings inside aren't dry. Next, we install the steady rest ring, which helps to limit pump wobble. Be very careful as you stretch it out to get it in place so you don't overextend it and break it. And this ring goes all the way up in the frontmost groove. And once again, we dip that in transmission fluid also. Okay, we're in place. Next, we have our 3 large hook type seals. They're cast iron and they are very delicate. So again, we need to dip them in our transmission fluid, expanding them very gently, using your index fingers to back up the spread so that you don't crack them. Just enough to clear the shaft. And once it's in its groove, we need to push from the opposite side of the gap into the shaft so that it extends beyond the groove. This is how it would look if I didn't hold it forward. So I'm going to push it from the back side so the ring's up out of the groove on the gap end. Hold one end of the ring down in the groove. Now the other ring can be brought alongside of it, in front of it, and allowed to release and lock together. If you recall, when we disassembled our transmission, the sealing ring in this area was a Teflon ring with a shim behind it. You can replace it with a new Teflon ring, or some shops will supply you with another hook type iron ring. Either one will do the job properly. In our case, we're going to be replacing it with the iron hook type ring. And once again, we're going to use a little bit of assembly lube and put a coating on all the shaft bushings inside the assembly. There's also a bushing at the front end of the assembly. With their bolts tightened, we can now remove our locating clamp, or if we use the valves, of course remove the valves. Last but not least, we need to replace the O-ring that seals the pump assembly to the transmission case. This is the largest diameter ring in the set. It's a square section O-ring, but we're still going to match it up to the new piece to make sure that it's correct. Once again, we wet it with transmission fluid, and on all the front pump rings, you notice one face will have a colored mark on it. That face goes to the outside. And you can see here, you can see it, the ring exposed, the colored ring. This completes assembly of the front pump intermediate piston assembly, and it is now ready for installation into the transmission case.